The room is still warm from bodies that left only minutes ago. Culver City, 1937. Cigarette smoke hangs low under the ceiling, blue and slow, refusing to clear. The long table is half cleared, water rings on polished wood, a forgotten ashtray, a folded napkin with lipstick pressed into the fabric like a bruise. No one is laughing anymore. A man leans back in his chair, the motion casual, almost bored. He smiles, not wide, not warm, just enough to show he isn't afraid of the silence. Someone had told a joke. Or called it a joke. We had her killed. The words land softly, no raised voice, no punchline, no pause for applause, just a sentence placed into the room like a dropped match. For a fraction of a second, no one reacts. That's the tell, not shock, not anger, recognition. Eyes lift, then lower. One man shifts his weight and checks the door without meaning to. Another clears his throat and doesn't speak. A woman at the edge of the table folds her hands together tightly, knuckles whitening, then relaxes them as if she has remembered where she is. This is MGM territory. Everyone here understands that. The man who said it lets the silence stretch. He enjoys it, or at least he doesn't rush to fill it. His tone suggests confidence, not cruelty. The kind of confidence that doesn't need to prove anything. The kind built on knowing exactly how much power you have and how rarely you need to show it. Someone finally laughs, a short, uncertain sound. Too late, too loud, it dies before it can become anything real. No one asks who her is. They all already know. Only weeks earlier, a 19-year-old dancer and extra named Patricia Douglas had walked out of a sales convention party with her career already over, her reputation already smudged beyond repair, and a story no one in this room wanted to hear. She said she had been raped, not by a stranger, by a salesman, at a studio party, on studio property, under studio protection. That alone was enough to make everyone nervous. But this sentence changes the temperature. Because it reframes everything, it turns a scandal into a lesson. The man who made the joke glances around, measuring reactions, clocking who meets his eyes and who avoids them. His posture is loose, almost friendly. This is how control looks when it doesn't need to shout. He isn't threatening anyone in the room. He's reminding them where they are. In Hollywood in the 1930s, power doesn't slam fists, it doesn't draw guns, it smiles, it jokes, it lets other people imagine the rest. A chair scrapes faintly against the floor, someone stands, murmurs an excuse, moves toward the exit. No one stops him, no one follows, the door closes softly. The man at the table watches, then he shrugs as if the joke has already served its purpose. Outside this room, the studio is busy erasing a problem. Doctors had already seen Patricia Douglas, not independent doctors, studio doctors, men who knew which side of the paychecks buttered their bread. Their language was precise, clinical, weightless, nothing conclusive, nothing actionable, enough doubt to stall momentum. Reporters had been tipped, not officially, quietly. The right names, the right whispers, a girl, a party, maybe she drank too much, maybe she misunderstood, maybe she wanted attention. In Los Angeles County, the district attorney's office had files stacked high with cases like this. The difference was that this case had a studio's name attached to it. A studio that funded campaigns, hosted dinners, made phone calls that were always returned. And the man who joked about her death knew exactly how those calls worked. Eddie Mannix had made a career out of proximity. He wasn't always the one who signed the papers or made the decisions, but he was always in the room when silence needed managing. Fixers don't need titles, they need trust. And Mannix had it from studio heads, from police officers, from people whose job it was to make messes disappear. That's why the joke mattered. If a powerful man shouts a threat, it can be recorded, repeated, denied, investigated. But a joke leaves no fingerprints. If challenged later, it can be waved away, taken out of context, misunderstood, you didn't hear that right, you're being dramatic, relax. But everyone in that room understood the subtext. Studios had ruined people before, careers vanished overnight, names disappeared from casting lists, apartments went quiet, friends stopped calling. Death wasn't the only way to end someone. And maybe that's why the joke worked. The man didn't need to explain logistics. No one asked questions, no one pushed back, because pushing back required belief that the system would protect you. No one believed that. Across town, Patricia Douglas was sitting in another room answering the same questions for the third or fourth time. What were you wearing? How much did you drink? Did you say no loudly enough? She could feel the story slipping from her hands, reshaped by people who knew how to phrase doubt politely. She didn't know about the joke. She didn't know that somewhere nearby, men in suits had already moved past the question of what happened to her and onto a more important question. What now? Back in the smoky room, the meeting broke without ceremony. No closing remarks. No agreement entered into the record, just people standing, nodding, gathering hats and coats. The kind of ending that felt clean on the surface. But nothing in Hollywood ever really ended. As the last man stepped through the door, the one who had spoken remained seated for a moment longer. He tapped ash into a tray, calm, unrushed. He had said exactly what he meant to say. And he knew it would travel. By morning, phone calls would be returned faster, papers would be shuffled differently, prosecutors would weigh their options with new caution, reporters would choose safer angles. All because of a sentence that wasn't supposed to mean anything at all. A joke. In that room, everyone understood that what had gone silent wasn't conversation. It was resistance. And once silence sets in, it's very hard to break. By the next morning, nothing official had happened. That was the point. No police cars, no court notices, no headlines screaming scandal, just a subtle change in airflow as if the city itself had leaned slightly in one direction. Phones rang earlier than usual in certain offices. Not urgent, not panicked, just enough to establish priority. A studio lawyer calling a courthouse clerk he'd known for years. A campaign donor leaving a friendly reminder with a secretary who didn't write anything down. A reporter being steered gently toward a safer story with better access. None of it felt dramatic. That was how pressure worked best. Inside Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the machinery was already moving. Meetings were called that didn't appear on calendars. Conversations happened standing up in hallways. So no one had to sit and listen too long. Names were repeated carefully. Patricia Douglas, David Ross, sales convention, party. Each repetition softened the edges. She's just an extra. He's not even talent. It was after hours. Every phrase shaved the story down, not to truth, but to manageability. Eddie Mannix didn't need to raise his voice. He never did. His authority came from inevitability. People listened to him the way sailors watched the horizon because experience said the weather followed his lead. When he entered a room, people adjusted their language automatically, not because he demanded it, because they wanted to stay in rhythm with the current. The district attorney's office felt the change too. Buron Fitz was no stranger to pressure. He had built his career navigating it. Los Angeles politics in the 1930s was a tight ecosystem, studios, law enforcement, newspapers, city officials, all orbiting each other in overlapping favors and unspoken agreements. Fitz didn't need explicit instructions, he understood implication. The case file crossed his desk with just enough weight to be noticeable. Serious accusation, real risk, but also complications. The kind that came with men who could return phone calls from governors, senators, and studio heads in a single afternoon. He read the medical reports again, the wording mattered. Ambiguity gave him room to breathe. The doctors hadn't lied outright, they just left spaces open. That was useful. Meanwhile, Patricia Douglas waited. She waited in police stations that smelled like sweat and dust. She waited in offices where men asked questions without looking up. She waited while the narrative rearranged itself around her quietly without her consent. At first, she believed time was on her side, that facts would eventually matter, that the truth, stated clearly and consistently, would force momentum. But momentum requires friction, and friction was being removed. Every day that passed added distance between the event and urgency, between anger and fatigue, between a young woman's voice and a system trained to outlast it. Friends who had encouraged her to speak up started offering different advice. Maybe step back. Think about your future. You don't want to be difficult. Difficult was the word that hovered just below the surface. Difficult women didn't get called back, didn't get extra work, didn't get sympathy. Inside MGM, casting lists quietly adjusted. Names were moved, Others were left untouched. Patricia's name didn't need to be crossed out, it simply stopped appearing. No memo announced it, no explanation followed, doors that had never fully opened for her closed without making a sound. And the salesman David Ross. He didn't hide, he didn't flee, he stayed visible enough to signal confidence. His presence itself became a message: if he wasn't worried, no one else should be. When reporters called, they were met with calm denials and friendly redirection. The party had been festive. Alcohol flowed, memories blurred, tragic misunderstandings happened all the time. The word rape was avoided whenever possible. Language was doing its job. Behind the scenes, the joke kept working. Men who had been in that room replayed it in their heads, not because they were amused, but because they understood it had marked a boundary. You didn't cross this story. You didn't push this case. You didn't make noise where silence was preferred. No threats arrived in the mail, no anonymous calls in the night. That level of drama was unnecessary. Fear didn't need spectacle, it thrived on plausibility. Everyone knew what the studio was capable of without being told. That knowledge governed behavior more effectively than force ever could. As weeks passed, pressure turned into routine. What once felt tense began to feel normal. Each small concession became easier than the last. Why fight a system this smooth, this confident, this certain of its own permanence? Buron Fitz delayed, asked for more review, raised concerns about evidence, spoke in measured tones about prosecutorial standards, all reasonable, all defensible. When the decision finally came to not pursue charges, it arrived quietly. No press conference, no statement aimed at resolution, just a procedural outcome that sounded boring enough to avoid scrutiny. The case stalled. Then it sank. Patricia Douglas read the news in fragments, a line here, a rumor there. She understood the meaning before anyone explained it. The silence had won. She was advised to move on. Eddie Mannix moved on immediately. He didn't celebrate, didn't gloat. He simply shifted focus to the next problem waiting to be smoothed. That was the fixer's art: never linger on success because lingering suggested guilt. But the joke never fully disappeared. It stayed with the people who heard it, a reference point, a reminder of how things truly worked. Years later, some of them would still remember the exact cadence of that sentence, the way it slipped into the room and changed the temperature without effort. Because in Hollywood, the most dangerous moments rarely announce themselves. They arrive disguised as casual remarks, light laughter, a smile held one beat too long. And by the time you realize what was decided, it's already too late to object. The system had spoken. Years later, when people spoke about that period, they rarely mentioned Patricia Douglas by name. They talked about the atmosphere, the way things were, how careful you had to be. The specifics blurred, but the lesson remained sharp. Patricia didn't vanish overnight. She simply faded out of the world that had once seemed within reach. The industry didn't blacklist her publicly. That would have required acknowledgement. Instead, she was left standing outside a door that no longer opened, no matter how long she waited or how politely she knocked. Casting agents stopped returning calls. Studios lost her paperwork. Opportunities evaporated without explanation. She watched other dancers, some less experienced, some less talented, step into roles she never even heard about. And there was no villain she could point to, no signature to contest, no moment she could replay and say, "This is where it happened." That uncertainty was its own form of damage. David Ross continued his life with minimal interruption, no prison time, no public reckoning. His name didn't become shorthand for scandal. In Hollywood, absence of consequence reads like innocence. And within MGM, Eddie Mannix's reputation only grew. He became more trusted, more relied upon, the man you called when something needed to stop being a problem. The studio system thrived on men like him, not because they were cruel, but because they understood something fundamental: power is most effective when it feels invisible. What haunted people was what happened to Patricia Douglas. It was how easy it had been. Years passed. The studio era softened at the edges. New scandals replaced old ones. Hollywood learned how to reinvent itself without ever fully reckoning with what it had been. But that joke still mattered. Because some of the men in that room lived long enough to see the industry change. The Hayes Code weakened. The old moguls died, courtrooms grew less friendly, reporters asked sharper questions. And yet, when they recalled that sentence, "We had her killed," they didn't remember it as a threat. They remembered it as a demonstration. It showed exactly how much had to be done. Which was almost nothing. No violence, no crime in the record, no order given, just consensus, just understanding, just silence doing what silence does best, protecting the powerful. Patricia Douglas eventually told her story again years later when the immediate risks had passed but the damage had already set. By then, she spoke not with outrage but with clarity. She described not just what happened at the party, but what happened afterward. The way people stopped meeting her eyes. The way doors closed without explanation. The way the story drained out of the room until it belonged to no one at all. Her account didn't explode into headlines. It didn't shatter institutions. But it lingered. And that lingering mattered more than anyone in that room back in 1937 could have predicted. Because once you hear how power truly works, you can't unhear it. The joke was never about death. It was about certainty. About knowing with absolute confidence that the system would bend before anyone asked it to. That confidence was the most frightening thing of all. Not the cruelty. Not the abuse. But the calm. The fact that no one in the room believed for a moment that the outcome could be different. And maybe that's the real ending of this story. Not in a courtroom. Not in an apology. But in the realization that the most dangerous decisions in history are rarely written down. They're spoken softly. Laughed off. Left to echo in rooms where everyone understands exactly what silence means. And long after the smoke clears, long after the players leave the table, that silence keeps doing its work.